I want to tell you what actually happened in Berea this week, because by the time this story finishes making its rounds through the usual outlets, it's going to be flattened into a headline that misses almost everything that matters. I sat with this one. I listened to it twice. And I'm convinced there's a version of this story nobody else is telling you straight. Todd Monken stepped up to that podium, took his questions, and gave answers that sounded, on the surface, like standard coach speak. But if you actually break down his words instead of just skimming the transcript, there's a real narrative buried in there. It's about Shedeur Sanders. It's about Deshaun Watson. It's about Dylan Gabriel. And it's about a quarterback room in Cleveland that is far messier, far more layered, and far more fascinating than anyone wearing a headset is willing to say out loud on camera. So let's start with who Todd Monken actually is, because that context changes everything about how you should read what he said this week. This isn't some rookie coordinator feeling his way through a press conference. Monken built his reputation the hard way, grinding through college programs and NFL staffs where quarterback development wasn't a buzzword. It was the entire job description. Reps, installation, demanding that players earn every single rep they're given. That's his DNA. That's why Cleveland brought him in to begin with. So when a coach with that pedigree stands in front of cameras and chooses his words about the guys who showed up, you need to understand that nothing about that phrasing was accidental. Coaches at his level don't slip. They don't misspeak in press conferences. Every word is a message, and more often than not, that message isn't really meant for the reporters in the room. It's meant for the locker room. It's meant for the three guys competing for the most scrutinized job in that entire building, and that's exactly what unfolded here. Monken touched on all three names, Sanders, Watson, and Gabriel. And the way he framed this offseason program tells you almost everything about how this competition is genuinely being run behind those closed doors. Whether the organization wants to say it plainly or not, here's where it gets interesting, and I need you to really sit with this part. Monken acknowledged, correctly, that the offseason program is voluntary. That's not opinion. That's the collectively bargained rulebook every team in this league operates under. Nobody is required to show up. But then he pivoted, and that pivot is the entire ball game. He essentially said the burden falls on his coaching staff to build something so valuable, so loaded with development and installation and connection, that staying away stops making sense for any serious player. Read that phrasing again. He isn't saying everybody has to be in the building. He's saying he's going to make the building so worth being in that absence becomes a choice with consequences. That's not a throwaway line. That's a coach quietly drawing a line in the sand between players who understand the value of presence and players who don't. And once you see the line he drew, the rest of what he said starts to hit differently. He talked about the ceiling on what a player can accomplish training on his own. Strength work, speed work, conditioning. Sure, a private trainer somewhere in Florida or Arizona can replicate a version of that. Nobody's arguing otherwise. But the chemistry built with actual teammates, the command of an actual scheme, real reps installed by real coaches inside the building, Monken was crystal clear that none of that exists anywhere else. That's exclusive to Berea. That's the pitch he's making to every single player on that roster, and it applies with extra weight to the quarterbacks specifically, because their command of the offense is the whole ball game. So here's the question that actually matters. Who took him up on it? Who showed up ready to grind, and who didn't? Because when Monken talked about being energized by his room, he wasn't speaking in vague generalities about the position group as a whole. He was talking about specific players, guys who showed up early, guys who put in time before anyone forced them to. That's an incredibly deliberate distinction for an offensive-minded head coach to draw in front of a bank of cameras, and it's not one I'm willing to let slide by unnoticed. We've talked before on this channel about how chaotic Cleveland's quarterback situation has been for years now. That's not some hot take. That's just the recent history of this franchise. So when a voice like Monken stands up and starts drawing these subtle lines about who showed up and who didn't, that's worth every bit of the attention it's getting, because it tells you this competition was never going to be decided purely on arm talent or measurables. It's going to be decided, at least in part, by who's mentally locked in from day one of an offseason nobody was required to attend. And from everything we've been able to track, Shedeur Sanders showed up early. He sat through those quarterback meetings. He put in the extra hours before the mandatory dates even arrived. That matters more than people want to admit. In a room that includes a former #1 overall pick, still holding one of the biggest contracts at the position in the history of this league, and a quietly polished arm in Dylan Gabriel, building his own case in the shadows, simply showing up ready to learn, is the bare minimum you need just to stay part of the conversation. Sanders cleared that bar. That's not nothing. That's a real data point in a competition that is going to be decided by dozens of them. Now let's get into the philosophy Monken kept circling back to, because I think this is the actual mission statement for everything happening in that quarterback room right now: development versus winning. Two completely different pressures, according to him, running side by side inside the same building. On one hand, there's the long-term project of building a quarterback from the ground up: footwork, decision-making, full command of an NFL-caliber offense. That takes time. Nobody serious about quarterback development would tell you otherwise. On the other hand, there's the immediate, unforgiving pressure of an NFL franchise that has to win games this year, not 3 years from now. That tension isn't unique to Cleveland, by the way. Every team carrying a rookie or a developmental arm on the roster is wrestling with some version of this same equation. You want to give a young player like Sanders the runway to actually develop the way he needs to. You don't want to rush him onto the field before he's ready and risk stunting everything he could become. But you also can't just ignore the win column, especially not with a fan base and a front office that have already endured years of instability at this exact position. Monken laid out his teaching structure in phases, and I have to say, it's a genuinely smart framework once you break it down. Phase 1 is pure fundamentals: footwork, hand placement, mastering the specific verbiage and terminology of this offense from the ground up. Phase 2 moves into scheme, taking those raw fundamentals and applying them inside actual play concepts, protections, and route combinations. Only after both of those phases are handled does he start layering in full speed, live reps against an actual defense. This isn't a system designed to throw a rookie into the fire in week 1 and hope for the best. This is a system built to construct a quarterback methodically, piece by piece, with almost no shortcuts. And here's the detail from that press conference that I think tells you the most about how demanding this environment actually is. Monken drew a very clear line between what the coaching staff is responsible for teaching and what the players are expected to learn entirely on their own time. His framing, paraphrased, was something close to this. Coaches shouldn't have to burn practice reps explaining the history and background of every single concept in the offense. That's homework. That's on the player. Guys need to walk into the building already knowing the playbook cold, the formations, the shifts, the motions, the terminology, so that actual practice time gets spent on execution, not memorization. Sit with how demanding that standard really is, especially when you think about what it means for a rookie stepping into a brand new NFL playbook for the very first time in his career. Shedeur Sanders doesn't get the luxury of slowly absorbing this offense over a full season. He needs to have it memorized before he even sets foot on the practice field, so every single rep with the actual coaching staff can be spent refining timing, refining his reads, refining the details that only get built through live repetition under a coach's eye. And that bar doesn't bend for anybody. It applies to Sanders, it applies to Watson, it applies to Gabriel. Everyone gets measured against the exact same standard, which, if you strip away all the noise, is honestly how a legitimate, fair competition is supposed to work in the first place. Before we get to the name that changes the entire emotional temperature of this story, I want to spend a minute on Dylan Gabriel, because I genuinely think he's the most under-discussed piece of this whole puzzle. Everybody's attention gravitates toward the rookie with the famous last name and the veteran with the massive contract, and Gabriel just kind of exists in the background of most of these conversations, quietly doing his job without demanding any of the spotlight. But coaches notice that. Front offices notice that. A quarterback who shows up, does the extra work, stays out of the noise, and lets his tape and his preparation speak for him is exactly the kind of player who can sneak up on a competition like this one. He's not walking in with Sanders' name recognition or Watson's financial standing. And honestly, that might work in his favor. Nobody's picking apart his every rep looking for a headline. Nobody's measuring him against a contract number or a draft slot. He just gets to compete, quietly, on merit, in a system that Monken has built specifically to reward exactly that kind of preparation. I wouldn't be shocked at all if Gabriel ends up being the most important name in this entire room by the time August rolls around, simply because he's the one player nobody's overreacting about in either direction. Now we have to address the presence that looms over every single word of this entire situation, Deshaun Watson. He's still on that roster. He's still attached to one of the largest contracts in the history of the quarterback position. And he's still, at least on paper, one of 3 names inside a competition that also includes a rookie who just walked through the door and a developmental arm who's flying under the radar. That is not a normal dynamic, and I don't think we should pretend otherwise. You don't typically see a player with Watson's financial standing sitting inside an open competition against a rookie with this much outside noise attached to his name. But that's precisely where this franchise finds itself heading into this season, and it's exactly why every single phrase out of Monken's mouth about this quarterback room gets picked apart the way it does. If this were a conventional situation, a clearly established starter with a couple of young arms developing behind him, nobody would be dissecting a press conference transcript line by line the way we are right now. But this isn't conventional. The contract situation, the injury history, the stop and start availability over the past several seasons, all of it means this competition is carrying weight that goes far beyond a typical summer quarterback battle. Every single rep Sanders takes this offseason, every rep Gabriel takes, every rep Watson takes, gets measured against that backdrop whether the coaching staff wants it that way or not. So let's pull all of this together, because I think the picture is actually pretty clear once you strip away the spin. Todd Monken has built a program around a demanding but coherent philosophy. Show up, put in the individual work, master your fundamentals away from the building, and let the actual coaching staff turn that preparation into execution once you're on the field with them. He's drawn a quiet, unmistakable line between the players who bought into that early and the ones who haven't yet. And he's running a quarterback room made up of 3 fundamentally different profiles: a rookie carrying immense physical talent and an equally immense amount of outside noise in Sanders, a veteran with name recognition and financial weight, but a genuinely complicated recent history in Watson, and a quieter developmental arm in Gabriel, who could end up factoring into this far more than the outside world currently expects. None of that guarantees how this ends. Monken did not name a starter at that podium, and anyone telling you he did wasn't actually paying attention to what came out of his mouth. What he did do is lay out the actual framework this competition is going to be judged by: development alongside winning, fundamentals before scheme, preparation before praise, presence before promises. And inside that specific framework, Shedeur Sanders has put himself in a real position to compete, which, given everything that's surrounded him since the moment his name was called on draft night, is a genuinely meaningful accomplishment all on its own, regardless of how the rest of this plays out. This competition is going to stretch across the entire length of training camp, probably deep into the preseason before anything gets settled for real. Every single practice report, every scrimmage look, every preseason snap these 3 quarterbacks take is going to get magnified beyond what it would in almost any other quarterback room in this league, precisely because of the dynamic we just walked through together. This isn't a normal summer for this position group, and it was never going to be treated like one. Every incompletion in a practice report turns into a headline. Every clean read from Sanders becomes a referendum on the entire draft class. Every rep Watson takes gets weighed against a contract number that isn't going anywhere no matter how camp plays out. And every solid throw from Gabriel gets treated like a footnote until, potentially, it can't be treated that way anymore. That's the environment these 3 players are competing inside of, whether any of them asked for that scrutiny or not. What strikes me most about everything Monken said this week isn't really about any one player. It's about the standard he's building the whole room around, a standard that doesn't care about draft position, contract size, or outside noise. Homework before reps, fundamentals before scheme, presence before praise. It sounds almost old-fashioned, And yet it's exactly the structure a quarterback room this chaotic actually needs. Strip away the contract situation, the draft night narrative, every hot take already written about this competition before a single preseason snap has happened, and what's left is just 3 players and 1 demanding coach trying to figure out, through actual work, who's earned the job. I don't think anybody watching this closely expects a clean, tidy resolution here. Competitions like this rarely wrap up the way the outside narrative wants them to. There will be weeks where Sanders looks like the obvious answer, and weeks where the questions about him get louder again. There will be moments where Watson looks like the version of himself that justified that contract in the first place, and moments where the injury history and the layoff show up in the reps. And there will almost certainly be stretches where Gabriel quietly outplays both of them and forces a conversation nobody was fully ready to have. That's what an honest, open competition actually looks like from the inside, even if it's uncomfortable to watch from the outside. So, here's where I land on all of this, at least for now. Todd Monken didn't hand anybody a starting job at that podium this week, and he was never going to. What he handed us instead was a blueprint for how he's actually going to make that decision, phase by phase, rep by rep, all the way through camp. And for a fan base that has watched this position get mishandled more times than anyone wants to count over the last several years, a coach who's this deliberate, this demanding, and this transparent about his own process might be exactly the steady hand this quarterback room has been missing. I'll be watching every snap of this competition as it unfolds, and I'll keep bringing you the version of this story that respects how much you already understand about this game, instead of the version built purely to generate a headline.